heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
Hello, welcome back to Louis Sinclair Investigates, the Dodleston Mysteries. Okay, now it's time to do our detective work, gathering the clues, the evidence, and seeing what conclusions we can draw from them, putting that jigsaw puzzle together. And to do that, we'll be asking these main questions over the final episodes of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full picture. First, is this just a hoax, brilliantly concocted by Ken, Debbie and Peter? Or have they been hoaxed by paranormal entities like poltergeists having malicious fun at their expense by spinning them a twisted yarn? Are the characters from the 16th century credible? Who or what is 2109? What are its powers? And was it actually the conductor, as it were, of an orchestrated deception for its own covert ends? And what's this experiment that seemingly is about the manipulation of time, with 2109's curious references to tachyons and UFOs? And finally, and at the very heart of the story, is 2109 actually communicating not just with the 1980s folk, but reaching out, through Ken's book, to the likes of you and me for some ultimate purpose? As we work through these questions, one thing I'd like to do is to involve you in the detective work. Sure, I'll point out some of the clues, the evidence, drop a few hints, and eventually show you the picture I've formed, but I'd like you to enjoy putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, as I did when I was working on this investigation. And though together we'll follow those clues and look at the evidence, some of our deductions inevitably will be slightly speculative. But there's one thing that isn't speculative, something very concrete, very real that we can investigate with certainty: the messages. And in this first part of the conclusions, that's what we'll start with, because everything else flows from them. And here's your first detective assignment. There's something about all the messages, the ones from the past and the ones from possibly the future, that forms a clear pattern, a clue, a revelation about what's really going on. And the key word for you to bear in mind is deliberate. So let's begin our investigation with the messages from the medieval folk, from Lucas, whose real name, as we know, was Thomas Harden, his clergyman friend, and the sheriff. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to know any grammar or anything else like that. It's all pretty simple. The first and major problem is that this medieval English isn't English as used in the early 1500s when Lucas was alive. I'll show you, and you'll see it immediately. Here's writing from 1537 by the scholar Sir Thomas Wyatt. I call not honesty that men commonly call honesty, as reputation for riches, for authority, or some like thing, but that honesty that was wisdom, gentleness, and desire to do good. And now from Lucas, around the same year. Me didst never fare for mean soul so much in mean lief, but so affared wert me, that made nold move way from this unkindly messenger. I'm sure that you can see the difference. The first uses spelling and pronunciation that's pretty similar to ours. Actually, the English of that time isn't usually called Middle English, but Early Modern English, whereas Lucas's is more like the English used by Chaucer over 100 years earlier, like one that April with its sure sorter, the drocht of March hath passed to the grote. Obviously something's very wrong, so let's find out why. We'll start our investigation of the medieval English by thinking again about the Beebs keyboard. If they had typed manually, then there's a problem. The 14 and 1500s were a time of great changes to English, not just to its grammar and vocabulary, as we've seen in the messages, but also to the alphabet itself. Ancient letters were being gradually replaced by Latin ones because of the huge influence of the Church and its exclusive use of Latin. For example, there was one very useful Old English letter called thorn. Here it is. It was used for a th sound, as in the. Gradually, the Latin equivalent th was replacing it, though in Lucas's time most people still use thorn, but when written it was often simplified to look rather like the letter Y. We even see it today in those fake old world signs like ye oldie sweetie shoppy, where the Y is actually a simplified thorn, in effect a th. So the ye on those signs shouldn't be pronounced as ye, but as the old sweet shop. Another useful and common Old English letter wiped out by the Church's influence was yoch, which, as you can see, looks a bit like a number 3. It did two main phonetic jobs. First, it could be used as a Y, as in yea, meaning yes, or the southern pronunciation of a G, as in yave, or as we now pronounce it, give. And secondly, yoch could indicate a sound rather like we're clearing our throats. Here's how night would have been written in Lucas's time and pronounced as nicht. But that yoch was being gradually replaced with the Latin equivalent, gh, so would look like our familiar spelling night. And eventually, as I'm sure you realise, the gh became silent. Although Lucas and his friend, being clergy schooled in Latin and aware of these changes, would have managed the Beebs' modern keyboard, a very basically educated sheriff, like Thomas Fowlhurst, wouldn't have had a clue. Where's thorn? Where's yoch? And yet he managed just fine, and used the Latin equivalents even though he wouldn't have known about them. Very odd. In fact, more than just odd, actually impossible. But he did. And that's why I think the Beeb at Lucas's house could be used either manually, hence his friend's garbage typing, and telepathically, hence the sheriff's success, despite the missing letters thorn and yoch. We've finished with concerns about the alphabet and the Beebs keyboard, so now let's look at the medieval language, where bizarrely we find both rubbish and sophistication. And as we go through it, there's one question we have to ask ourselves. Is this strange mixture deliberate? So let's begin. Rubbish first. And we'll start with a few simple but glaring errors.
My friend, pray what strange demon are you?
Here we're looking at the word what, W-O-T, obviously meaning what. In medieval times it was never intentionally spelt W-O-T, never. Indeed, pronouncing it as what is fairly modern. In the past it was wat, and W-A-T is how it was spelt in the part of England where Lucas lived. And this isn't just a one-off error, it's all the way through the medieval messages. Next,
one day you will all sit at my table.
And here we're looking at the word plank, referring to the table that all of them would sit at one day. In Middle English, plank never meant table. It would be board, as in the modern English phrase board and lodging, food at a table or board in a temporary place to stay. Plank only ever meant plank, typically one used in house or shipbuilding. Now let's look at this mess.
My friend, you are, I think, a noble man. You said also that you are a learned man.
Here we have ye, yao, and thou, each one meaning you. I'm afraid that's nonsense. Only thou is grammatically correct here. Ye is you when we point to many people, not just one, just a ken in this case. Yao is also you for many people, but it's never used at the beginning of a sentence, only thou. So the ye be and yao seda should both use thou. Actually, be and seda aren't right either. They should be thou beast and either thou saidst or saidest. Next, hath is the Middle English for has, H-A-S. So Lucas's sentence actually says, I has seen many alterations, which is obviously rubbish. In both modern and Middle English, it's I have seen. Simple as that. And there's a lot of these in the messages. And before we finish the medieval English with a truly puzzling quotation, here's an error that will, in due course, tell us a lot about what's going on. As we know, our pronoun I can also be me. So, I saw Binky and Lulu having fun and destroying our plants. And Binky and Lulu saw me. I saw Binky and Lulu saw me. I at the beginning of a sentence, and me later in a sentence, after a doing verb like saw. And that was true in Tudor times. So what do you make of this? Me do fear for my life. Wrong. It should simply be, I do fear for my life. Starting a sentence with me, as I'm sure you realise, is just a lazy cliché by authors who want to make their texts sound a bit medieval. However, Lucas sometimes correctly uses the pronoun I, as here.
I am so confused.
The strange thing is that half the time Lucas uses I at the beginning of sentences, correct, and half the time me, which, as we know, is incorrect. But why half and half? We'll come back to this a little later. Anyway, let's finish our review of the medieval messages by looking at that puzzle I mentioned. Here we'll focus on the words hath and bribed. As before, hath isn't right. Something that maybe a modern hoaxer might get wrong, either through ignorance or through a fake medievalizing of the messages, basically to try and fool us. Hath does sound more medieval than have, but have is what they would have used in the 1500s. But a modern hoaxer would never have known that bribed in Middle English means stolen. Someone has stolen Lucas's house. This is a fairly sophisticated use of Middle English in the messages, a word whose meaning has changed so much that only an advanced scholar would know about it, like David York, a renowned medieval linguist who kindly helped me with this analysis and the translations. So as we can see, rubbish and sophisticated Middle English mixed together, though all of it at least 100 years out of date. Is it the clumsy work of hoaxers, or is it deliberate? And please remember that Lucas was a highly educated cleric who had graduated from Oxford University. Without doubt, he would have spoken and written high-quality medieval English, not this mess. Actually, the language is so bad, I've barely shown you the tip of the iceberg, that no one of Lucas's time, educated or not, and regardless of which part of England they lived in, would ever have spoken or written in the language of these messages. But I think that could be a significant and cleverly concealed clue as to what's going on. And now we'll take a look at one example of the messages from the past written in Latin. In today's English we could write, Peter wrote a letter, and addressing Peter directly, hello Peter. In both cases, Peter is, of course, spelt the same. But in Latin, they'd look like this. Petrus scripsit epistolam. And as a greeting, Ave Petrae. Not Petrus, but Petrae. Because in Latin, words often change depending upon how they're being used in a sentence. And with that in mind, let's take a look at part of one of the Latin messages. It starts with a greeting to Peter. Petrus. Wrong. As we know, it should be Petrae, like in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, when Caesar is about to be murdered and sees that his best friend Brutus is amongst the assassins. In shock he says, Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus? That US at the end of his name has turned into an A, as we'd expect. So not a good start, and this is very basic Latin. So our reasonable conclusion is that whoever or whatever wrote this doesn't actually know Latin. But this nice theory bites the dust when we look at the beginning of the third line. Lucasque means Lucas, furthermore, and combining those words into Lucasque is quite sophisticated Latin. So we've got rubbish Latin and sophisticated Latin in the same message, just like in the Middle English. And don't forget that the author, Lucas's friend, was a clergyman who, without doubt, would have been highly proficient in Latin, the language of the Bible in those days. So is this deliberate? And finally, what about the language possibly from the future, from 2109 and 1? It appears that that very first message was from 2109, not from Lucas as implied by the signature LW. And how do we know that? Because only clairvoyant 2109 could have foreseen Lucas's imprisonment and the sheriff's or pussycat's efforts to release him by visiting the king in London. And though seemingly nonsense with bizarre capitalization, it was written in modern correct English. But that's not true of 2109's later messages, including this one, where 2109's English wasn't correct. Cheap spelt wrong, haven't with the apostrophe in the wrong place. There also spelt wrong. It should be THEIR. So once again, fairly sophisticated language mixed in with rubbish. By now I'm sure you've spotted the pattern running through all the messages. The authors or author can write perfectly good Middle English, Latin and Modern English, but for some reason mixed some rubbish into it. But is there any evidence that this could be deliberate? I said I'd come back to the I and me issue. You'll recall that half the time in the large sample of messages that David York and I studied, Lucas correctly uses the pronoun I, and half the time me, which at the beginning of a sentence is wrong. 50-50. That isn't random when one side is correct. It's deliberate. Clues to see if anyone's bright enough to spot it, perhaps? Another deliberate thing is that the vocabulary, the choice of words of those medieval messages, is very close to words we use now in modern English, which it wouldn't have been. The author has selected ones, synonyms, that most resemble the modern equivalents, to make it easier for us, the modern readers, to follow the text, as you saw when I was telling the story. For example, using prison rather than the more common Middle English word hold, because it's more recognisable to us, and despair rather than one hope, which literally means faint hope. And there are many other such examples. So again, the vocabulary seems to have been deliberately chosen for our benefit when we read the messages. And it's the same for the spelling. Spelling only became fixed as a result of printing. Even Shakespeare, 100 years later, occasionally spelt the same words differently. He even spelt his own name in several ways. And yet the spelling of all the words in the medieval messages is remarkably consistent, and it simply wouldn't have been. We saw this earlier. A medieval person would have randomly used both thou saidst or thou saidest. Consistency wasn't important to them. In medieval texts, there's rarely any consistency of spelling, but there is in the messages. Again, it seems deliberate for our benefit and for Ken and his friends. And this is when all those clues complete that pattern, the thing that connects them all. We know that 2109 is in control. It said so.
I can interfere with all signal transmitting devices, including computers. I have the power to make you do exactly what is required.
Which leads us to an obvious deduction, that 2109 is deliberately influencing how the messages from the past and from the 1980s are being expressed. The individuals may be in control of what they're trying to say, but not in control of the language, the transmitted language, as displayed on the screen. And all the characters had noticed this. So, in September 1985, 2109 said that it had modified Lucas's messages for their benefit. In October, Lucas had said that some of his earlier messages were either not from him, like that very first one about pussycats, or had been altered. And in January the following year, Peter had speculated that telepathy from external influences was guiding them when writing their messages. And this would explain the apparent anomaly of Ken and Debbie suddenly being able to write in medieval English without Oxford-educated Peter being there to advise them. Someone or something, almost certainly 2109, is giving us a whole load of linguistic rubbish and then, rather cheekily, putting in bits of sophistication, as if to say, actually, I do know the languages, I'm just messing with your heads, but can you work out why I'm doing that? So yes, the manipulation of the language in the messages does seem deliberate, but was it to attract attention for some reason, or was it just a game? Let's see in The Hoaxers, Part 5 of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full story. Until then, I hope you enjoyed your bit of detective work. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you after the break. Cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.